and we are going to see what is the remaining. So, we left to that the Miss M. Amel was just teaching the French class. It was a last class for him, and in one day how much he can teach in that last class, grammar and lesson, poem, literature, everything he was just making it, and children all were just listening. And Frank, a student who was not interested in the lesson, was asking him that he was very much feeling that he was not that much serious when sir was taking class, that French sir was taking class, that was running in his mind and he was feeling. And let us see what it is. I think to that I had never listened so carefully, and that he had never explained everything with so much patience. It seemed almost as if the poor man wanted to give us all he knew before going away, and to put it all into our heads at one stroke. So, here you can understand, in that last class, in one thing you want to put everything in the mind, and he was not so casual in listening, and he was not so careful in listening. At the same time, the teacher also was not patient to teach that much, always just threatening and giving punishment if they are not knowing. And he was very patient on that day, and he was teaching. He had started like that in the beginning, surely he would have got some interest in learning, and he also was not interested. So, both was there, and he was feeling in that. After the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. So, the grammar class had got over and they started writing. That day, M. Amel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round-handed, France, alas, France, alas. They all look like little flags floating everywhere in the classroom, in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of the desk. You ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. So, there was no sound at all in the thing everywhere. The handwriting was so beautiful. You know that how we will be having on celebrating some festivals, or sometimes we will be having flags hang everywhere. So, like that this word had been written, France, alas, that was written, and it was everywhere with a neat handwriting. And everyone was writing, and when they were writing, only the scribbling sound of the thing is heard. Not even one child or one person in that room uttered a word. So, you can understand how silent it was, the classroom was. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the littlest ones, who worked right on the tracing their fish hooks as if that was French too. On the roof, the pigeons cooed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? So, here what had happened, there was pin drop silence, everyone were writing, and only that writing scribbling sound only was heard. Once some beetles, you know that in a classroom, if a beetle or some insects comes, there will be all will be making noise, and they will be looking, they will be admiring. But here, once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them. Everyone was interested in writing, and no attention was paid to that. Not even the littlest ones, even the littlest children who was kids were very much interested in other things, but they also were not taken and not bothered about it. Who worked right on tracing their fish hooks. They were just tracing the fish hooks as if that was French, as if that was French too. On the roof, the pigeon cooed very low. So, the pigeon was cooing, made a sound, and that also was heard by Frank as a French word. It was also looking like a French word. And I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeon? So, what was running in Frank's mind? So, here okay, it is just making a sound. Whether tomorrow they will make it to do, they are making us to learn German, whether the bird also will be have to learn a German. So, it was running in the mind of Frank. It is very clear, children. Whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw Hem Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing first at one thing, then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just now how everything looked in that little schoolroom fancy. So whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw M. Hamel. So he was just looking Hamel and sitting motionless. He was not moving. He was motionless and sitting in his chair and gazing first at one thing. So he was looking, gazing at something, and he was looking that only for a long time without any movement. Then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom fancy. So he was looking one and next at one, that's it, for gazing for the same time without motion. So here the boy was noting this all, how the teacher was motionless and he was thinking something in the mind. For 40 years he had been there in the same place, with his garden outside, the window and his class in front of him. Just like that, only the desk and benches had been worn smooth. The walnut trees in that garden were taller, and the hopin that he had planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. For 40 years he had been there in the same place. The master was, French master was there for 40 years in the same place with his garden outside the window. He was having a garden outside the window and his class in front of him. So there was a class in front of him. Just like that. It was just like that. And only the desks and benches had been worn smooth. The walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hopin that he had planted himself. So he planted himself that if twinned about the windows to the roof. It was just grown up to the windows and to the roof. So that had been planted by himself. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all, poor man, to hear his sister moving about in the room above, packing their trunks, for they must leave the country next day. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all. So here the boy was thinking, oh, he'll be feeling to leave this all, because he planted himself and he grown, he watered, and he was just made it. So how will be feeling to leave this all, to hear his sister moving about in the room. So the teacher's sister was moving here about the room, packing everything, their trunks, for they must leave the country next day. They have to leave the country the next day. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. After the writing, we had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted that ba, bi, bai, bo, bo. Down there at the back of the rooms, old Hauser had put on his spectacles and holding his primer in the board and spelled the letters with them. So, but he had the courage to hear every lesson to very last. So here the Frank was listening all the lessons very carefully, because it was the last lesson for him. After the writing, so after finishing writing the lesson, we had a lesson in the history. So they had a lesson in the history, and then the babies chanted there. So the babies chanted there ba, bi, bi, boo, boo. That is all French letters, phonetics they were pronouncing. Down there at the back of the room, old Hauser had put on his spectacles and holding his premier in both and spelled the letters with them. So he was teaching them, and he made the spelling of that letters. You could see that he too was crying, his voice trembled with emotion. So when he was pronouncing with them, his voice was very trembling and was crying and with emotion. So there was emotion in him, and it was so funny to hear. It was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. How well I remember it, that last lesson. So here the boy was thinking how you could see that he too was crying. So the teacher also was crying. His voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. How well remember it, that last lesson. So here he was able to feel that the teacher also was crying, and he is also feeling very much worried about it, and that made him feel emotion. So it was the last class, he was not able to control his emotional feeling, and when he was making the last sound of that lesson, he was feeling the tremble in his voice, and he was just making it with the children. And when he thought this all, it was the last class, he was thinking, how well remember it, that last lesson. So he was able to remind the last lesson very clearly. All at once the church clock struck 12. So all at once the church clock struck 12. So it was 12 o'clock, it is the time for them to finish the class. Then the angelus, at the same moment the trumpets of the Persians returning from drill sounded under our windows. Amel stood up very pale in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. So he was very pale. So there, when the clock struck 12, the musician parade sound had been heard, and his face became pale. The teacher's face became pale because he is going to put a stop for the lesson. My friend said, I, but something choked him. He could not go on. So my friend said So my friend said and I was starting with the word I, and he was not getting any sound. But something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, Viva la France. So it was goodbye like that, as large as he could. His might, he wrote as large as he could, Viva la France. So he was writing on the board. So he was uncontrollable, he was not able to say any words. And then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk. So he went to the blackboard and took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large he could, Viva la France. Then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word, he made a gesture to us with his hand. School is dismissed, you may go. So here, that was the last word. Franz, he wrote the word, last word in the So Viva la France, that was the last word written on the board, and he was leaning on the board and standing, and then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word he made a gesture. So he made it without even looking at them, he made a gesture to us with his hand. School is dismissed, you may go. So he made a sign of just to leave the class. It was the last class for them, and with that, it was just making them to move. So it was the last class for them. So he was showing a sign, school is dismissed, you may go. School is dismissed, you may go. So he was just making that, know that in the last class he was not able to feel emotionally his feeling, and he was not even able to say with his words. So he showed a gesture, the last class is over, you may dismiss, you may go out. So that was the thing. And children, we have learnt the good lesson, the last lesson, and I hope you all enjoyed the lesson. We'll continue in the new lesson in the next class. Until then, bye, see you.